how you could dance to the end of the daily theme music, and there really isn't any logical way to do it.
No, it would be very fun if there was like a flash mob that suddenly developed around the theme.
Hello, London. Thank you so much.
We are here for our first international event, and we are thrilled.
We are completely thrilled. And what you just heard is a classic week in the life of the Daily. It is baffling, it is relentless, and it is disrupted by Donald Trump.
Yes,
that
always.
That's the story of our lives for the past 2 years. I am Michael Barbaro. I'm the host of The Daily.
And I'm Theo Balcom, and I'm the executive producer of the show.
Theo is the first employee of The Daily.
Yes.
When you hear those credits, you've heard her name from day one. She makes this thing you love. Thank you, Theo.
Yes. And as I said, we're here for the first time. Finally, Michael and I got to get out of the studio.
Yeah, leave the cage.
Leave the cage.
Hit
and
the road.
We really never had any idea when we started the show that there would even be this many people listening to what we made. So the fact that you do listen and you're all here is
extraordinary.
Really exciting.
Yeah.
So we wanted to, tonight, talk a little bit about why we're here, making this our first international trip.
Yes, and that is because of the tremendous mess you've made of Europe. And we knew we wanted to come and tell the story of the EU in this moment. And we've been wanting, frankly, to tell that story for some time.
Yeah.
We finally had the bandwidth to do it, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about the state of the EU, populism and nationalism in the European Union. But before we get to that, we want to spend a little bit of time talking to you all about the story of The Daily.
Right.
Where we have come from and what we are and why we are.
Yeah, because I think if you guys found out where we came from, you would be shocked that we're here. So we started the show with 3 producers. I came from National Public Radio, a woman named Lisa Tobin, who's the head of our audio team, and then another producer, Andy Mills, from Radiolab, a show at WNYC, if you're familiar with that. We were the 3 producers that started the show, and then we had a host who knew nothing about audio.
Nothing about audio. And I want to talk about that. But first I want to show you what it looked like when the 4 of us started making The Daily.
So we were literally in a storage closet. This is
on
the
the
kind of
16th
space
floor.
the New York Times gave us.
Yeah. Now they say they're really proud of The Daily.
Right.
It's the flagship audio show, but this is how they treated us at the beginning. We had a utility closet on the 16th floor of the Times that had previously been used for rubbish and also had been used for a computer that contained all the leaked documents from WikiLeaks that had no internet connection. So it was like a bunker. So if you can see, there's some foam walling around. And this is where we spent 24 hours a day creating the show. And Thea wasn't joking when she said that I knew nothing about audio.
Yeah.
I had been a print reporter at the Times for a decade. And I had not so much as listened to, maybe I'd listened to 1 or 2 podcasts.
Right.
When you all asked me to host The Daily.
Right, inspired a lot of confidence.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the question was sort of like, what do we do with this guy? He has a lot of relationships around the newsroom.
Yep.
He can help us land interviews.
Yep.
But I think the big question mark was kind of what I would sound like.
Right, so Michael would kind of go into an interview in the early days, and he would ask a good question, and then the guest might say something, and it might be kind of funny, or it might be kind of heartwarming, or it might be kind of interesting. And a typical person, if you're having a conversation, would sort of react, right? Michael would just sit there, say nothing. So the initial notes were like, if something's funny, Michael, you could go ahead and laugh. That would be a good idea.
Yeah, that would be a great idea. It turns out if you don't laugh in audio, then the audience doesn't know that they're supposed to laugh.
Yeah.
And so, laugh. And then you will laugh.
Right, and that's also how we got to, people comment all the time if they're diehard listeners of the show. Maybe some of you experience this. From our fair host, that all came about because we were like, you need to be in the conversation.
Right.
You need to be responding.
Mm-hmm. and that was a sort of a real thing I did as a print reporter, but it suddenly translated to audio.
Yeah.
But what didn't translate was the sudden need at the beginning of the show and at the end of the show to to actually recite words that were written on a page
Right.
At the beginning of the show. And I really, really struggled with that because there was this kind of intangible sense I wasn't doing it right. And we're going to show you what that sounds like.
Yeah.
All right, ready? We're just start tracking. If we lose something, we'll start up again. You've never watched me track. It's painful. I'm feeling very seen. It's Wednesday, February 1st.
It's Wednesday, February 1st.
It's Wednesday, February 1st.
It's Wednesday, February 1st.
Yeah.
What's the matter? I'm not hitting Wednesday right? I know, these directions are not meaning a whole lot to me. It's Wednesday. It's Wednesday, February 1st.
There you go. That's a wrap.
I still think the first one was fine. All right, now we got to fucking narrate. It's 8 p.m. on Tuesday night.
I have to say, as a producer on the show, that was also cut down a lot. We edited that down a great deal.
For the record, I just want to say I really do think the first Wednesday was fine.
Okay, yeah.
The other thing you should know about The Daily is that besides a host who had no idea what he was doing at the beginning, we had a show without an identity. And it took us about a month to figure out what we wanted to call the show.
It was really hard to find a name.
Names are hard.
Names are really hard.
Everybody thinks they have a great idea for how to name a podcast, and it always begins with the.
Uh-huh.
And so we sat in a room and we came up with a lot of thes. The story, the briefing, the lead. The lead was unfortunately a CNN show.
Yeah.
So we canceled
that.
that.
Didn't quite work.
So then we settled on the name of the show that we absolutely loved, and we even came up with iconography for it. And I want to show you that.
For whatever reason, we were in love with this bird.
The bird.
Yeah.
So First Up was going to be a huge hit. And First Up was going to wake you up in the morning with a chirping bird in your head. And this yellow bird became so beloved on The Daily. And we shared this with people all over the company, and they got excited about it. And then at the last minute, the executive producer of New York Times Audio, she just woke up with this epiphany that this was all wrong, and that the show needed to be called what we called it internally as a prototype, as a pilot, just The Daily, the thing we make every day.
Right.
And when she made that decision, she said, well, but we're going to take the bird with us. And the marketing people said, if the name dies, the bird dies. And so the bird died, and we had a huge fight with them. And so instead, you now know what we have. We have the gradient, the sunrise, the gay pride flag. It's whatever you
all
need,
in there.
whatever you need it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So we went through lots of iterations of what we were going to call it, how Michael was going to say the date. You know, there's so many things that you have to figure out. And it really, at that time, the idea that the New York Times was going to make an audio show was just a very bizarre concept, right? What is this newspaper doing getting into podcasts? And so we had a lot of thoughts about what that actually might mean. Like, what is the show actually going to sound like at the end of the day? Should it be more formal, right? After all, this is all the news that's fit to print.
This is the august New York Times.
Right.
So we'd be delivering the news in audio the way we kind of deliver it in print, with all this kind of authority.
Right. Or did we want it to be more informal? And we kind of got a test of this very early on. If you listen to this next clip we're going to play, which is from the very first episode of the show.
Yeah, day one.
Hello?
Mr. Green, it's Michael Barbaro from the New York Times. How are you?
Yes, go ahead. How can I help you?
So David Green, if the name doesn't ring a bell to you because you don't live in the United States, is that he is the founder of Hobby Lobby, which is at the center of a major United States Supreme Court case over contraception and whether or not companies can opt out of the United States Affordable Care Act's mandate around providing contraception, and in particular, the morning after pill. And he wanted to come talk to us about Donald Trump's choice for the Supreme Court nominee, which was being announced the next day.
Because if you remember, there was a sort of crazy night where the president was going to announce one justice that he was going to nominate to the Supreme Court, but he had set it up in a sort of The Bachelor style. So he had two different nominees.
Right.
and he was going to pick one. So he ends up giving the rose to
Neil Gorsuch.
Neil Gorsuch.
Right. And David Green is a big fan of Neil Gorsuch because Neil Gorsuch endorsed his decision not to provide this contraceptive. So
we call him up, and the conversation got pretty heated.
The liberal press will never say this. They will never say that we offered 16 different contraceptives, and I don't see you doing it. That way you guys won't write because it doesn't fit your narrative, does it?
Well, the beauty of audio is that you're saying it and our listeners are hearing it. So this moment, yeah, it was kind of intuitive. It's like, but the reality is, as a print reporter, you would never run that. You don't run people sticking their middle finger up at you.
Right.
As you don't say in the story that, David Green, who told us he didn't trust us, said, quote, you just don't do that.
Right. Even in a radio interview, like that would be one of the first things to go. You're questioning our authority. You're kind of sticking your middle finger in our face.
You're being provocative.
Right.
And instead, we made a decision as a group, and remember, this is day one, so we don't really yet know what the show is, that we were going to keep this in the episode. And it very quickly became a kind of manifesto, that here was a guest who told us on day one that he didn't trust us to tell his story, and we trusted the listener to hear that, absorb it, and make a decision about whether or not we'd given him a fair shot. And I think because we had just come out of the 2016 election in the US, and because a lot of our kind of confidence in ourselves had been kind of shaken by that election, we were, if we were being honest, in a period of reckoning around what we had done right and what we had done wrong in that election. We felt that moments like this were a kind of corrective to that. That if we let people challenge us and if we were transparent with a listener and we let you see into our process and understand how we make decisions, then you would trust us more.
Right. So this became a real model for us as we went on to let you all into the reporting process, to understand what happens when we call sources, to understand what happens when we call reporters, and how they get the stories that they get. And so that was day one. There were many more days after that. And one of the next moments that really felt important to us was when the New York Times, as it does, had a giant scoop, a breaking story.
This was around, of course, President Trump and Russia. And what happened was that the president had fired his FBI director. And that part, everyone understood. Our colleague Mike Schmidt had broken the story that before that had happened, the president had invited the FBI director to dinner and requested his loyalty over dinner. And, of course, didn't quite get it.
Right. And we had to understand what this story was, right? It was the most important thing going. We needed to talk to Schmidt because he was the person who knew what had happened. He was kind of the only one. So we said, okay, Mike, can we get you on the show? And it got a little complicated.
Hey. Sorry, so I got the folks here at Kinko's to let me use the phone.
How did you do that?
I told them I needed to call the office. But the problem is I got my laptop on the other side of Kinko's here. I'm afraid some Russian spy's going to take it, so I got to keep my eyes on it.
Michael Schmidt called us from the only landline he could find. So, Mike, what did you find?
So Comey gets fired on Tuesday. I go in the office 7 a.m. on Wednesday morning. We're just trying to figure out what the heck happened, and start making some calls early.
So Mike could only talk to us from the Kinko's in middle of nowhere. I don't know.
Chicago. He wouldn't let us say it first because he was on some super secret reporting trip. But it was moments like this that, as Theo says, you would immediately cut from your work at National Public Radio. I mean, also, you once joked that you would never have aired that interview.
No, it's a terrible phone line. Can you imagine hearing that on the BBC, like an actual reputable broadcast? Like, nobody would air that.
But so we like being disreputable and sort of letting you meet a reporter like Mike exactly as he is. He is such a character. This kind of swaggering reporter. He doesn't quite have a gun slung to his side, but when you listen to The Daily enough, you kind of imagine like a pen is holstered to his side. And this episode was a breakthrough for us because it was such a compelling story, and it was told so compellingly from the middle of a Kinko's.
Right. And
does anyone know what Kinko's is, by the way?
Yeah, it's like a coffee shop.
Kinko's is a now defunct brand name of a store where you would go in the United States to make copies of things at a stage in our history.
Xerox machine. Like, how deep do we need to go here? Like,
but that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But it did a couple years ago.
Yeah. So anyway, so we make this part of the story that we tell, and we ended the interview like this.
Mike, thank you very much, and please thank
Joshua is going to kill me here. He wants me to go.
the folks at Kinko's. Joshua, thank him very much.
He's in training. All right. Bye.
Bye, Mike.
Thanks, Joshua.
And so now everybody is in love with Joshua. He becomes,
Except his bosses.
Yeah, right. He becomes part of the story.
It's our understanding he did not get in trouble.
No, I hope not. Yeah.
So today the Daily is not in that tiny room anymore. We have a set of studios. Proper studios.
We don't do bad phone lines anymore as much.
We're on the 3rd floor of the Times building with the rest of the newsroom. We have been integrated and shown the proper regard.
Yeah, right.
And
now we look like this.
We are a team of almost 20 people.
Because of the size, we're able to do things like leave New York. Come to London.
And make a very special series of stories, which we are going to tell you about in just a moment. So here to discuss what is about to be a remarkable and really unusual run of coverage that we're going to do are 3 people who've been intimately involved in thinking about Europe, thinking about you, thinking about this mess you've made and how it's going to get cleaned up. And that is our Berlin bureau chief, Katrin Bennhold. Hi.
Thank you for coming. Good to see you.
Didn't know we were going to do such formal greetings. We have our London correspondent who's been covering Brexit, Ellen Berry. And we have daily producer extraordinaire Claire Tennisgetter. Theo is going to briefly leave us, but don't worry, she's going to come back. So thank you all for making time for us. Before we start this discussion, we are going to play a clip from this 5 days of daily episodes that are going to start to air next week. And I think you'll get a feel for kind of what we're up to.
Funny, isn't it? Isn't it funny? You know, when I came here 17 years ago, and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you? I'll make one prediction this morning. The United Kingdom will not be the last member state to leave the European Union.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This week on The Daily.
Us, the European citizens, we are living in a bubble.
Before the recent rise of nationalism in the United States, in Europe, a decades-long plan to stitch together countries and cultures into a united Europe was ultimately blamed for 2 crises.
How many people are you on the boat?
500. The UN estimates about 5,700 migrants have arrived in Italy from Tunisia since January.
One of mass migration into Europe.
It's a big problem. There are too much of them.
The other of crippling debt.
Are there a lot of Italians that want to leave the euro?
Yes.
Together, they set off Europe's own wave of nationalism.
We've had enough. We don't want to be governed by you. We want to govern ourselves.
While the UK has elected to leave the EU altogether, nationalist movements across the rest of Europe want to blow it up from within. It's Monday, June 10th.
It's almost Monday, June 10th. I think that one sounded better, right? That one sounded fine. Yeah, our secret is out a little bit in that we do record episodes ahead of the time sometimes. We like the era where everyone thought we made the show between midnight and 5 a.m., but that actually never existed. But don't tell anybody that. So, Katrin, I want to start with you because you have just finished this, I think it was 9 days straight of reporting with Claire as you guys tried to kind of impossibly ambitiously figure out the story of what's happening in Europe right now. And in a way, you kind of embody Europe yourself to an unexpected degree, and I want you to talk a little bit about your background and how you fit into this.
Yeah, so I'm German originally, but I would say I feel European first. And I think in this country, that probably makes me a citizen of nowhere. Or I think Theresa May, what'd she call us? Queue jumpers. That's me. So, but seriously, I mean, Europe for me has always been kind of the story of my life. It's sort of, my own family is kind of a product of Europe. So I was born in Germany. I ended up going to Britain to university because I could, because the EU allowed me to go to university anywhere in the EU, and it was actually for free at the time. And, you know, as a bonus, I actually met my future husband at university. He's a Welshman. And, you know, our two grandfathers had fought on opposite sides of the war. And his grandfather was actually a prisoner of war in Germany. His grandmother reminded me of this quite a lot.
How early on?
What's that?
How early on?
How early on?
In the relationship.
Oh my God, this was the moment. First time I met my husband's grandmother, this was like, she had this thing with partners of her grandchildren. She had like this categorization between specials and floozies. And I was still in the floozy stage, so this was important. And we had lunch at her, like, she's like this officer's widow in Kent, like very posh. And, you know, I met her in this house, the old rectory, and I was super nervous, more nervous than tonight. And the first question she asked me when we sat down to lunch was like, oh, so you're from Germany? I can't do the accent. So you're from Germany? My husband was a prisoner of war in Celle. Do you know Celle? So that's that story. But you know,
you did get married though, yeah.
Yeah, it took a few more years. Eventually I did become a special, but yes. So we now have 3 children, my husband and I, and they are basically speaking our 2 languages. They feel equally at home in our 2 countries. They're basically little Europeans. So for my children, Europe is just a fact of life. And I remember trying to explain Brexit to my 7-year-old daughter a couple of years ago when we were still living in London. I was a correspondent here. And I sort of explained to her that there were some Brits who wanted to leave Europe. And she looked at me in utter astonishment and said, where do they want to go? Africa? So yeah.
And what did you respond?
I was sort of lost for words. But I found that it sort of summed up the absurdity of the situation for her in that moment brilliantly.
I feel like the one thing that occurs to me as you tell your biography is that you're also German, so you understand something very profound about the roots of the EU and this moment.
Yeah, I mean, the EU was basically born in this moment of, you know, after this terrible war and after the Holocaust, you know, in the 40s and 50s, people sort of stuck their heads together and decided this can't happen again. So that's kind of the early promise of the EU was peace and prosperity. Mm-hmm. So in a way,
and connectedness.
This idea that, you know, we got to just sort of suppress nationalism, this nationalism that has been fueling ethnic hatred and fueling war, ultimately. And, you know, this was the idea to do it, to get so sort of collective and intertwined that war became unthinkable. And so, in a way, today, seeing the reemergence of that nationalism was a reason for me to sort of say, look, we got to check in with people and see what Europe means to them today. What does it mean today? It used to mean this thing. And in some parts of Europe, particularly where I'm from in Western Germany, this promise was pretty much kept, right? I mean, for Germany, the EU was kind of rehabilitation and gave Germany a positive identity and a massive export market on top of that. So what's not to like? But, you know, the idea was to sort of go beyond that and sort of go dig deeper into the countries where all this sort of nationalism is rising now and just really hear people's stories, hear what they have to say.
And you get paired with 2 producers, one of whom is not here, Lindsay Garrison, one of whom is very much here, Claire Tennis-Sketter.
Hello.
And so how did you guys start to logistically figure out something as complicated as telling the story of Europe in 9 days?
Well, I knew that I wanted to talk to Katrin and just do a story on the AfD, the far-right party in Germany. So for a couple of years now, I've been calling you every other month and saying...
She was stalking me. We're like on the phone.
Yeah, no, I would go on our little computer system and I would find a story she's working on and call her and say, I see you have this interview. Do you think you could make that into a daily episode? But nothing worked, nothing worked. And then finally we have a call and you say, well, I'm about to go on this big trip. I'm about to go to 5 countries.
And she's like, can I come? And I'm like, okay. And she's like, can I bring Lindsay as well? And I'm like, okay.
And then I said, how long are you planning this 5-country trip for?
Oh, yeah. And I was like, 5 days?
I said, I don't think we'll need a few more for audio. And we settled on about 9.
I think you guys were like, can we do like 2 to 3 weeks? And I'm like, no, because the election is actually going to happen before then. And they're like, oh, okay.
Why is 5 days not enough for audio?
So in audio, you really need to get to know characters. You need to just gather so much tape. We're rolling all the time, recording from the minute we wake up. And
so they're like, meet me at 4 a.m. at Tegel Airport, and we'll start the trip. And they're like, and they're like, and if you see us before you're through the security, don't talk to us. Pretend you haven't seen us, because we have to actually record that first moment. I'm like, what? And she's like, yeah, we're going to start rolling and recording you basically at 4:30 in the morning. Is that okay? And I'm like, what are you going to ask me? And they're like, oh, you know, why are we going to Strasbourg first? What are you looking to find on this trip? What does nationalism mean? I'm like, holy shit. So I'm like, you know, I didn't tell this to them until the very last day.
Yeah, the last day.
I was like, you know what? I scripted the answers out to those questions. Like at 11 p.m. the night before, I was like, what am I going to say at 4 in the morning to these? So I was like learning this stuff by heart. But then I realized it's totally hopeless because they roll like 24/7.
And one of the reasons we do is because we want these very natural moments. So these scripted answers actually didn't sound that great.
They didn't make it.
They
didn't make the tape.
Because she had kind of memorized them. And what we want are just these really human, natural moments. And I have one more funny story about that first morning.
Oh my God.
So Lindsay and I woke up 4 a.m. to go to the Berlin airport. It's actually, the first time I'm meeting Katrin in person. And we start recording from the moment our alarm clocks go off. Actually, we hit record before we even shut off our alarms because we want those little moments. We want the alarm. We want the door closing in the taxi cab.
Why? Why do you want those so much?
We want to show the motion. We want you to feel like, as you're listening, you're there with us. You're traveling from point A.
You're in bed with Claire as the alarm clock is like.
You hear me brush my teeth and pack my suitcase. So Lindsay and I, we recorded every moment. We get to the airport. We're about to go through airport security. And she turns to me and she says, do you think I should stop it or just roll through? And I'm the more responsible. She's the more creative. And I was like, turn it off. You're going to get in trouble. But of course, she's like, no, it'll be really good audio with the beeps if it successfully goes through. So she leaves it running. Immediately, the airport security man in Berlin picks it up and is this on? And says, you need to delete this right now. She goes, no, we have 2 hours. We need these little moments. You're going to ruin our audio documentary. And she charmed him, and eventually she went into a tiny room, and I immediately grabbed my bags and went away and was like, don't delete my files too. But she ended up getting to keep it, and we can use all those moments, the moment that we met Katrin.
Yeah.
And that is how the Daily was detained in Berlin.
It was almost the end of the trip.
So as you guys start, and you're rolling in bathrooms and bedrooms and all the rest, what was the first stop, and how did you envision the trip going?
So the idea was kind of to start where Europe started. This is on the French-German border. Mm-hmm. You know, these sort of arch enemies that had sort of been fighting for centuries. And it was interesting because it was kind of the one place where we still found kind of unfettered idealism for the EU. A lot of people spoke to us about a United States of Europe. And I'm not just talking about professors and sort of educated types, but like, you know, an electrician, a carpenter. I mean, working class people whose families had experienced in this region, which had changed between France and Germany like 6 times, you know, since the 17th century. You know, I met this priest whose grandfather had fought for the French in World War I, and then his father had fought for the Germans in World War II. I mean, this is a crazy every region. I mean, they sort of joke about keeping German street signs in the basement, just in case. So, but, you know, if you think of the EU as something, if you think of the foundation of the EU as kind of the memory of war, you know, we're sort of in trouble because that memory is fading right now. And this was the one place where that memory still felt very alive. And the EU was something very concrete because that border now that, you know, these people used to die over is basically non-existent. People live on one side of the border and go to work on the other. So that was our starting point. But we then pushed into France, because in France, as you know, there's this Yellow Vest movement, which has been making headlines and has been challenging this young, dynamic president who only a couple of years ago was supposed to be the savior of France and of Europe, and is now really hated. We discovered. You know, Yellow Vest movement was one stop, and then we pushed into Italy because we felt that while in France this movement was challenging the government, was still just a leaderless sort of chaotic movement. In Italy, you have a situation where this nationalist hard-right movement, the League of Matteo Salvini, is already in government, still just as a coalition partner, but it's rising fast, and a lot of people think he will probably be the future prime minister. Moving on from Italy into Poland, which is sort of is the largest country of the latest group of joiners after the Cold War. And here you have a nationalist government that has been in power since 2015 and has had a majority and has had the power to really attack democratic institutions. So we wanted to see this arc and basically see what happens as the far right and as nationalists gain power.
You keep using this word nationalism, and as I prepared for this interview, I kept wondering what the difference is. And Ellen, I'm interested in what you think about this as well. What is the difference between nationalism, which we now talk about with lots of alarm, versus patriotism, which is something we talk about with reverence, you know, an affection and love for your country? And where do you see the line between the two as you're starting this trip?
So I probably started out having a similar feeling, broadly speaking, about nationalism just being something bad. I mean, I'm from Germany, and certainly as I grew up, I mean, I barely saw the German flag because it was kind of a taboo. And when I did see it, I thought that's probably a Nazi. I mean, it was like really like that. And that's
people didn't use it.
No. I mean, very, very rarely. And as that changed, and it has gradually changed, and under Angela Merkel, and you know, because we hosted that wonderful soccer World Cup in 2006, it really was a moment. And so this sort of idea of civic patriotism kind of has emerged, and people are now able to use the flag again. But so that distinction so speaks to me. But what I found on this trip is that actually a lot of the nationalist movements have caught on to this. And if you ask the AfD in Germany today, or if you ask the League in Italy today, if they're nationalists, they're like, no, we're patriots. Nationalism has a negative connotation, we're patriots. So for me, by now, I would say the distinction really ought to be between ethnic nationalism or patriotism and civic nationalism or patriotism. It's sort of ethnic versus civic, because everything else is just terminology, and what these people are doing actively, and they will say so, is we occupy language. And so they're claiming patriotism for themselves just as much as anyone. And so I feel like the adjective is almost more important.
What do you think? Where does the patriotism end and the nationalism begin here?
I mean, one thing that has been really interesting looking at Brexit is how much Englishness is wrapped up in the Brexit project. It's not a British project. And people who describe themselves as English rather than British are far more likely, I think it's 85% more likely to be supporting Brexit. So there is a sense of having lost something, lost identity, or lost a claim on the country that at one point was secure. So I think maybe it's a sense of loss, something having been taken from you.
And as you travel to these four countries and you're identifying what the nationalist movements look like, what are you finding about them? What is their kind of fundamental animating force, and how persuasive are they?
So I would say my first observation is that almost none of the people we spoke to in these movements actually want to leave the EU. That's just you guys. And I think you may have put them off, even the populists. But almost no one we spoke to was sort of happy with how the EU worked. I mean, one sort of distinction, if you want to, it's simplistic, but it sort of is true to what we saw, is that we found that a lot of these people spoke about kind of a fear of a Muslim invasion. This idea of Christian values suddenly has become very, very important, both in Italy and Poland. And we got a sense that there's almost sort of a battle of ideas unfolding in Europe right now between two different visions of Europe.
And what are the two visions?
One is sort of liberal democracy, and that's the one that sort of has come under attack right now, because it very much is embodied by the EU and the EU institutions.
And when we say liberal democracy, what exactly do we mean?
So liberal democracy is basically the idea of a pluralistic society. It's not just democracy where a majority sort of makes decisions for everybody, but where minority rights are protected, where you have an independent judiciary, you have a sort of a free and open society. And not so long ago, Western Europe and then Eastern Europe, as it signed up to these conditions in order to become member of the EU, these values sort of reigned. But they've really come into question because they haven't been delivering to a lot of people. This is something that we found. I mean, this is us on the roundabout outside of Reims in northern France, northwestern France. This is sort of one of the holdout roundabouts in this whole Yellow Vest movement. So we sort of arrived and we tried to arrange these interviews ahead of time with people, and actually they didn't want to talk to the press, they weren't interested, but we just sort of showed up. And it was a really interesting moment because you arrive at this, you can see it, it's a stormy day, it's this sort of muddy intersection, muddy, not grassy knoll on the corner of a big intersection, and you got this, I don't know if you can see them, but these big kind of, multinationals sort of all around. You got an IKEA, you got a Burger King on the other side, and here's this sort of blazing bonfire, and a few kind of plastic chairs sat around it with people in their bright yellow reflective vests, just sort of sitting there and basically trying to bring down this president, which is the basic thing that united them, but also saying, democracy is not working for us. A lot of the people we spoke to had never voted, had never bothered, or some of them had voted for Macron, but felt completely betrayed even a couple of years in. So I don't know if you agree, Claire, but my sense was that we heard a lot around this trip, we sort of felt that Europe had become almost like synonymous with these big abstract things like liberal democracy, or austerity, or wage stagnation, or migration in the case of Italy. So I felt a lot of resentment.
Certainly,
yeah.
I feel like there's always this moment when you're out doing interviews about these movements that feels to me like the Willy Loman moment in Death of a Salesman, a person who feels like their birthright has somehow been slipped away from them, that what they thought they were going to get in the fullness of their adulthood has been taken. And that's the moment where they bang on the table, or that's the moment when they say something about who they are. And that feeling is kind of wrapped up in all these movements.
You described the... Well, go ahead.
No, just because what I thought was really interesting on that roundabout, you can't see it, but behind these chairs is this small wooden shed. And it's a shed that a retired carpenter, Guy, whom we interviewed at length on that roundabout, and who's been there pretty much every day since November 17th, at least for a few hours every day, who's been built and rebuilt a couple of times because it had been taken down by police in between. And this shed, to me, was fascinating because it was this like small 7 square meter shelter that in a way was a microcosm of the French way of life that they were trying to hold on to. There was a small bar in there with coffee, sack of potatoes, pétanque balls. There was a sofa, and there was so much camaraderie. In about 5 minutes after this photo was taken, this is mother of all downpours. It was like raining and storming, there was lightning, and everybody sort of crowded into this tiny shelter.
Screaming, everyone ran in together, and they had gone out in the roundabout to give flyers to these cars to get support, garner support for the Yellow Vest movement, which is dying, and they're trying to get more.
But
people
why
to
is
come
the
out.
EU a threat to this kind of museum of French life? Is I guess what I'm struggling to understand.
Why what, sorry?
Why is the European Union a threat to this kind of little encapsulation of Frenchness that you're seeing? What are they afraid of? They're telling you.
We asked them this question, and they basically said that Europe is synonymous with wage competition. The minute the Eastern European countries joined, they felt that their salary increases leveled off. They felt that they had to work harder, longer hours, more overtime and not get paid for it because they were subcontractors now, companies from Bulgaria or Poland that would offer the work more cheaply to the big companies that their own companies was trying to get contracts for. They really sort of said that that period between 2004 and 2010, and then of course the financial crisis made it all worse, they felt a sort of leveling off in their living standards. And a lot of them are really struggling. And we saw their paychecks, and we saw the sort of what is left at the end of the month. And it's basically nothing. And the sort of humiliation of having, being an electrician in France, second generation. Your father was an electrician before you, but in those days was able to buy a house when he was 30 and bring up a family in a kind of semi-middle class way. Here you are now, in this generation. You can barely pay your rent. You have to ask your father for a loan when your boiler breaks. You have to tell your children in the middle of the month that there's not going to be enough money until the end of the month. You can never take your children to the cinema or to Paris. And so in this context, this movement started growing. And these people were telling us about the sense of community and of family on these roundabouts. This guy, Jeremy, whom I just described, this electrician, he basically said he'd never voted, he'd never been on a demonstration. This is mainly an apolitical movement. If some of them vote for Marine Le Pen, it's because they want Macron out. But he was basically saying the first time he showed up on the roundabout, it was sort of like curious because it was happening in a city. And he saw all these people that he sort of vaguely knew. And then he met some others, and they discovered that they all had the same problems. And what a relief it was to find this community and to realize they're not the only ones. So to me, that was really, really insightful. And also humbling, because let's face it, we are all part of a very privileged elite. And things like liberal democracy and Europe have worked very nicely for us. But you realize when you travel the lands in Europe today that there are a lot of people who feel that liberal democracy is not working for them.
What you're describing sounds very generational. I have an image in my head of older French, Polish, German complaining of an era that's gone, of an identity that's been robbed, of a life that no longer exists. Am I wrong in assuming that?
So I went into the story sort of with the same assumption. And it's not a bad assumption. I mean, if you look at Britain, if I'm not mistaken, the younger people are more likely to be against Brexit, and it's the older people who've been in favor of it. But I was quite shocked to find that along the way we met a lot of young people who have either inherited or just simply embodied and embraced very xenophobic views, actually. I mean, one of the moments that really stuck with me is meeting this father, an engineer in Italy, in Tuscany, on this market square in Arezzo. Somebody who votes on the center-right. He happened to be there when we were there with this sort of league politician. But we started talking to him, and I sort of asked him a variation of your question, and he said, the young people, they really hate the migrants. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean? And he said he was watching the television news with his 16-year-old daughter just a few days earlier. And he said they were watching this report about a migrant ship that had capsized, and 100 migrants had died. And his daughter just gave the thumbs up. And he said he was shocked by this. And she saw his shock and the sort of horror in his face and said, Dad, don't look so shocked. Everybody thinks this. And, they sat down for a long conversation and sort of, him and his wife kind of tried to talk to their daughter about human rights, about the difficulties some of these people have gone through and so on. And he said he believes that conversation probably hasn't made a difference. The other small story in that context was when we were on the plane to Poland and just by chance ran into this school class from the Normandy beaches. It's D-Day today. And it was basically teenagers aged 13, 14, and they were on an Erasmus program. They now do these for high school students. In my days, it was only university, but they were going on a one-week exchange to a Polish. And I was talking to the teacher who had organized this, and asked him, "So why did you do this?" And he said, there was this time around 2015-16 when the migrant crisis was really sort of hot, that he started hearing his students refer to migrants as rats and other sort of vermin, basically. And that they were applauding the idea of Trump kind of building a wall. And he sort of said, in this region of France in particular, how is it possible that they do not think of their own history and of all of that and of Europe and he said their grandparents are even too young to have experienced World War II, and so they have no conception of history and of the sort of these kind of values. And so he decided, having heard them talk like this, that he needed to get them into one of these exchange programs. So who knows what comes out of it. But to answer your question, I feel that we cannot rely on the fact that this phenomenon will just die out with the older people. I feel like there's a young cohort that is very much swept up in it.
You could even see where it could start to grow. This Yellow Vest family that you talked about that didn't have anti-migrant feelings. They're just apolitical. This father who is an electrician and his wife and his 3 kids, and the 2 parents would go to this roundabout, they said, just about every day. And we went over and met the whole family and talked to their 14-year-old daughter, Luna. And she, when we asked her, do you feel European? You're 14, you've grown up with nothing but the European Union. And she said, what does it mean, European? I'm French. And then later on in the conversation, when we were asking her about her dreams, what she wants to be when she grows up, and she kind of seemed, she had this twinkle in her eyes, and she said that she really hoped to work with animals, maybe to be a vet. She had a dog that was running around the entire time we were interviewing her. But then she paused and said, but probably I'll just be an electrician like my dad. So you could see that there wasn't...
But you know what's interesting, and just sort of coming off that story, France was very much a sort of, nobody had anything good to say about the European Union flag, or there was seemed to be very little emotional tissue or whatever with the European Union. What was interesting then in Poland was that to us that the European flag has actually become a symbol of resistance there, where the
resistance to.
What's that?
Resistance to
the government in power.
To the government in power.
Justice, the Flag Party.
So the pro-democracy movement in Poland, which is sort of pushing back against the attempts of the nationalist government to sort of undermine independent judiciary and come down hard on the independent press, is flying the European flag on the streets in protest marches. And this editor of this liberal newspaper told us that when a nationalist lawmaker had sort of referred to the European flag as a rag, he'd gone out and bought one and put it up outside his house. So it's very interesting, the sort of emotions that are elicited in different parts of Europe by this European idea. Of course, the other side, the nationalists in Poland, have a very different narrative again. Their narrative is that, Poland fought for independence, Poland toppled communism, and now these Western countries sort of say they won the Cold War and are telling Poland what to do. And for them, they're not going so far as to say we want to leave the European Union, but they're saying we want to take the European Union out of Poland. We don't want interference.
Ellen, I want to talk about what happens when the nationalists get to power and they have what seems like a concrete demand from the people to do something like leave the EU, which is what's happened here, and it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. So what does that tell us about these movements when in a way they kind of get what they say they want?
Right, well, Britain obviously doesn't have a nationalist party, never has, notably, and in some ways this was an experiment in a sort of stable, well-organized system, taking on a populist project and trying to carry it out in a responsible way. And of course, what we have seen now is it's broken the system. I moved here a couple years ago, and I thought I had a good, reliable theoretical framework for Britain based on my extremely close reading of the works of Agatha Christie. And what I understood from that is that this was a small island where people knew how to not take up too much space and live in relative comedy, which is punctuated by the occasional homicide, which is then resolved in an orderly fashion. And compared to America, where we like to break the china, this is a country that has tended to resolve its existential differences in a more friendly way. So we had a scorched earth, winner-take-all civil war that we've never gotten over. but the British conflicts have usually been solved with some kind of fudge. So not a monarchy, not a republic, but some fudge in between the two. It's not Catholic, it's not Protestant, but again, like something was found. And so this was my thesis, and I loved my thesis. I loved it so much, I put it in the paper. And my colleague, Stephen Castle, who is better informed on all of these matters than myself, he was like, "Are you sure you want to put that in the paper?" Anyway, I put it in the paper, and the thesis was called, "What could be more British than a compromise everyone hates?" Yeah, so I think we all know how that turned out.
Oh yes, we have an image that that indicates this from.
This is biographical material. I didn't write this.
That is not your handwriting. That would be your child.
So I was confidently striding into the fray with my thesis. What could be more British than a compromise everyone hates? And then the votes started. So I covered meaningful vote 1, meaningful vote 2, and my daughter June, who was up in the audience,
hello.
She was kind of waiting for it to be over. And I had become invested in this idea that somehow people could be persuaded to give up their ideal outcome and find some common ground just to get it over with. And obviously, we all know that's not what happened. We have a situation of such paralysis. Really, an example of how bonkers this is that last night a viable candidate to succeed Theresa May proposed getting the Queen out of her palace to put Parliament into recess for long enough to finish a no-deal Brexit. And when they're talking about getting the Queen out of her palace, something's definitely wrong.
But did the Brexit vote in the end diffuse the nationalism in a way that maybe doesn't require the last step? Is that a possibility? Is that what we're looking at?
I would say that it's been the opposite. When I go out and talk to people about this, they are no longer interested in whether Brexit is a good idea. They want to know why their vote is being ignored. So that is the issue that has completely replaced the question of whether Brexit is good for the country. And I think it's going to take years to get it out of the system.
This is very reminiscent, actually, of what we heard. And this is interesting because I was France correspondent for like 10 years, and was there when there was this referendum in France on this European Constitutional Treaty in 2005. And if you recall, the French voted no to that. And then a couple of years later, some fudge was arranged, and pretty much the heart and soul of that treaty was kind of put into this other treaty that now wasn't put to a referendum and just passed anyways, the Lisbon Treaty. And I sort of didn't pay much attention to it. This is like ancient history as far as I'm concerned. When we were there, the people on that roundabout were talking about that. They were talking about how their vote had been ignored. And when we were in Italy, people were like, remember Monti during the financial crisis and then the debt crisis, where basically the European Union put pressure on Berlusconi to resign, the elected prime minister, whatever you think of him, and put in place basically a technocratic government for 2 years under Monti, totally undemocratic, and basically raise taxes, lower spending, appease financial markets. So, you know, again, in Italy it was like, democracy? What democracy? So I felt like, it reminded me of Brexit, and much as you heard from my introduction, I mean, as much as I took Brexit personal in some ways when I was living here, and much as I sort of inside of me thought maybe a second referendum would be a good idea and maybe it will never happen, actually, by now I feel like it's hard to get away with not doing it after that vote. You know, like.
I mean, I also think people they're beginning to want a different flavor of democracy. So, I mean, in the system right now, you have a whole bunch of well-meaning officials who believe that they were elected to use their judgment as they see fit to protect the interests of the people. And then you have a different part of the government that believes that when the people make their wishes clear, even if you think it's a bad idea,
you do it.
You have to do it. even if it breaks the China. And these are two groups of, I think, well-meaning people who are putting such strain on the system that it may change permanently.
So what's the flavor of government we might get as a result of that?
I mean, I think what you get is alienation. I mean, people who no longer, I mean, we've been going out and talking to people who are watching this play out, and the sense of kind of disappointment in British democracy, and they use those words. If people don't believe that democracy works, they're going to accept something less. Or maybe they even want something more authoritarian.
And by less, do we mean authoritarian?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if they're promised something, promised a different system that won't make them, if they're promised a different system that will fulfill their demands.
Well, this brings us to kind of the impossible question of the night, I think, which is if the EU is founded on the principle of liberal democracy as a fundamental good, and people are questioning whether that functions, what is the state of that institution in Europe, and therefore the idea of the European Union itself? Admittedly.
How long do I have it? So, I mean, I think it's interesting. We all saw the European elections play out, and there's two interpretations of that result, right? I mean, there is one benign interpretation which says that the wave of populists and nationalists getting into the European Parliament wasn't as bad as a lot of people had predicted and expected, and you could, take sort of hope from the fact that in several countries, including Germany, the Greens, sort of pro-liberal and pro-refugee kind of parties gained. But the other interpretation is that if you take the long view, having nationalists and populists sort of steadily gain ground and just get entrenched in the system and sort of rising from 20 to 24% or whatever, maybe not to 30, but steadily gaining ground, that is a movement that is happening and that is a movement that is worrying. And if you had told me, for example, now people said in Germany the AfD only got 11%, but if you had told me 10 years ago that there would be a far-right party in parliament and the biggest opposition party in the country, that would get 11% in the European elections, I would have been utterly speechless. So if you take the long view, something big is happening. What exactly? I don't think we'll know until like 10, 15 years from now when we look back. I think Europe has sort of turned into a battleground. There is this battle of ideas, and I don't think it's decided. But I think, I think liberals have to put up a fight. I don't really see them putting up a fight right now, but they also have to be incredibly humble, because we are hearing from people that it's not functioning, it's not working. And there's almost, and we've heard this in Poland from the nationalists who are sort of saying, democracy is doing great in Poland, thank you very much. It's doing great in Hungary. We're doing what the people want. We're doing what the people elected us for. We have a majority. You guys are just dreaming of majorities. I think democracy in Germany is not looking so healthy. So I think it's important for the liberal democracy side to really listen deeply and
accept the skepticism.
And analyze sort of where they may have gone wrong. I mean, this idea of illiberal liberalism comes to mind. This idea that maybe liberals haven't been tolerant enough of views that aren't their own. And then, of course, the bigger, and maybe the question that we found in every single country is this issue of social injustice, and just this question that the system isn't delivering. So we've talked about democracy, but there's a broader question about our pairing of capitalism with liberal democracy and the sort of social divide right now. There's big questions out there, and at the moment, I'm not seeing a whole lot of people grappling with them seriously. Everybody's sort of defensive, and what we found in Italy, for example, is that even in places where the League didn't do well, all the other candidates were just referring back to the League and Salvini. They were sort of arguing against it, but they weren't taking there's no language for the future. Nobody's selling a positive vision for the future to voters right now. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, you've got the Greens, and you've got these sort of few examples. And then you've got these unorthodox examples, people like Greta Thunberg, who probably have more leadership in them than a lot of the sort of leading, party leaders. And there are people like Macron, where, like I said earlier, a lot of people thought he's the guy. He will save Europe, and he will save liberal democracy. But he hasn't come up with the sort of innovation and the new ideas that really tackle these deep issues, I don't think.
I asked you before we did this interview where you see the greatest leadership right now, and I want you to tell everybody in the audience what you said. When I said, where in non-nationalist governance are you seeing great leadership?
Where in non-nationalist?
Yeah, and I was referring to Europe, but do you remember what you said?
I don't. It's so long ago.
You said China. You said China.
Oh. Well, yeah, it's true. I mean, so it's true. That was a brilliant comment that I made earlier, and I've already forgotten. But it's true. I mean, we're in this world where you've got these nationalist leaders who are great at being leaders, by the way, right? They have the language. It's not a language of the future. It's more a language of the past, but that's what people want to hear. They want that past. They want to preserve things. So that's sort of Trump's language. It's the language of Salvini. It's the language of the people in Poland, of the Law and Justice Party. China is not a democracy, but it has a project for the future. It has a language for the future. It knows where it's going, and it's doing pretty well. And so the question is, what do those defending liberal democracy in Europe, what language of the future are they going to find? I mean, this is what I'm not seeing right now. Yeah.
I mean, at the end of daily episodes, I always sum things up. So what you're saying is, I
love this. You know the journalist motto: first simplify, then exaggerate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you're totally teaming me up.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, things in Europe are so messy that the model is a communist government in China. First summarize, then exaggerate.
So, I love it, yes. So I will just tell you that even Chancellor Merkel of Germany has admitted that when you challenge the Chinese government on human rights and they shoot back, well, we are lifting millions of people out of poverty on a pretty effective schedule. We are working for human rights. Even she said, it's very hard to not agree with that. So again, I don't think the model is communism. By the way, it's basically authoritarian capitalism, right? That's what China's model is. I don't think that's the model anyone should strive for, but I think it's really interesting to observe that the effectiveness of government there, the delivery is something that certainly in our very messy and paralyzed democracies right now, I mean, it's a threat to our vision of the future, sure. And we need to sort this out.
We are going to pause. Thank you all for this conversation and take some questions from you, the audience, about Europe, China, the New York Times, and the Daily.
And Michael, anything you want to ask?
No. And I really want to thank you all for this discussion. We're going to bring Theo back onto the stage. And we have some microphones up in the balconies that I think you're all going to queue up to if you'd like. And then we're going to have microphones being passed around the audience for questions. So why don't we start with lucky number 2?
Look up there.
Oh, why don't we start with lucky number 4?
Thank you for joining us in London, first of all. And thank you for everything that you do. I think it's amazing work. My question is about anti-European sentiment. And I'm curious, in your conversations with people, if you feel like the #1 driver is maybe fear of a European sort of entity dominating policy and like a lack of relationship, or if it's fear of other people around Europe who they're unfamiliar with, like immigrants, or potentially economic reasons. What do you think is the #1 driver?
So if I was to simplify and exaggerate, I would say it's a fear of losing a familiar way of life. And that actually sums up a lot of the things you touched on. And in different places, different things are important. In Poland, we found that values was the sort of driver of anti-European sentiment. There was this idea that the EU was un-Christian. It was sort of somehow morally void, and it was now imposing its sort of gender madness and LGBT craziness and all these like rights and all this stuff on Poland, this Catholic country that wanted to be just a Catholic Christian country. And that sort of idea of a Christian Europe felt very dominant, prominent there on the nationalist side. In Italy, migration was something that came up in every single conversation, even though it's no longer a red-hot crisis at all in terms of the numbers, right? But that sort of experience of 2015 and 16 of being on the front line of this and being like on the Mediterranean and seeing hundreds of thousands coming through has really stuck with people, and it felt like it sort of traumatized quite a lot of people. And again, there was a sense, I mean, this is changing my town, my city, my familiar way of life. And then finally, I would say, in terms of the economic factors, there is a sense that Europe is sort of the face of capitalism. Europe is the face of globalization to Europeans. It represents the sort of free market that has allowed companies to take advantage of wage competition and this idea of a race to the bottom. So the bitterness about a Europe that serves companies and not little people was voiced a lot. And again, this sort of conflation of this idea of liberal elites and European elites, that was used almost synonymously. We heard that. So liberalism has become conflated very much with economic privilege. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel it's a very complicated patchwork. But at the bottom of it all, it's just people. It's the Lohmann moment. It's this idea of losing what you're used to, your familiar way of life.
That's insightful. Thank you.
We're going to go to number 2. Oh, the numbers are throwing us. 2.
Hi. Just a question that was asked a bit earlier, but I wondered whether you could give a bit more detail about. I appreciate that there's a lack of leadership on the liberal democracy side of the equation in Europe, but are there any interesting thinkers who maybe aren't in a leadership position but are putting forward interesting new ideas that maybe we should start to follow, listen to, read?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that in civil society there is a lot of leadership emerging now. And I mean, I mentioned Greta Thunberg, you've all heard of her. I think she has shown amazing leadership and has really put the climate change issue on the map. In terms of sort of politics, I mean, I personally like Timothy Garton Ash as a thinker. I think he's very smart on these subjects. One of the things he said that has really stuck with me is that, this is sort of a time, so if you think of liberal democracy as kind of having this sort of heyday, like these 30 years of incredible expansion between 1974 and 2004, all the indicators show that the number of liberal democracies just expanded in the world. It's like from the democratization of Portugal all the way up to the color revolutions. It was just like more democracy, more liberal democracy. The Cold War ended. It was this sense of like it can only go in one direction. And it was kind of a democratic revolution. And then it plateaued, and ever since then, it's been going in the other way. It's kind of the counter-revolution. And what Timothy Garton Ash says, he says, whenever there's a revolution, there's a counter-revolution. So we shouldn't panic. And in some ways, this may also be an opportunity. Because what we had during the Cold War is this competition between two systems. And in some ways, liberal democracy paired with capitalism was tamed by this standoff with communism, which claimed to be the social system which gave everybody jobs and so on. And if you think back, our welfare states were going strong during those decades. And there has been, since the end of the Cold War, an end to that competition, and as a result, sort of deregulation and a lot of, much less regard, perhaps, for some of these social justice issues. And now we have competition again. We've got a sort of competition between liberal democracy and, even though it's sort of an oxymoron, illiberal democracy, right? Viktor Orban calls his system illiberal democracy. It doesn't make sense, but it's, it's a sort of an illiberal modernity. A different system. And I think that competition may just be the moment to focus minds. And it may just be a moment, and again, we won't know for a decade or so, to spark some of that leadership.
So populism, nationalism tames capitalism and therefore makes a better liberal democracy, potentially.
Yeah, I think it focused minds at the time. I mean, I remember my mom in West Germany, growing up in the 80s, always saying that, the GDR, East Germany, was sort of the elephant in the room during these union negotiations for wages and so on. It's like, the capitalists wanted to make sure that people in their system thought they were living in the better system. And so it's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Emma Bennell. I just wanted to sort of expanding on that slightly. We had a movement in the late 80s, which was social Europe, where the European project moved from being very much just an economic project to a social project. And that was also when the right-wing movement started to kick back, and it was felt at the time that that was very unusual, and they were the mad end of politics, and then they got further, and they got further, and then we Brexited, and now they run things. And I'm interested in how you beat the money that is linking together the extreme end of capitalism and the extreme end of the victims of capitalism, and how you break that link, because those to me seem to be the two groups most involved in being emotionally invested in Brexit.
Great question.
Well, there just is a big problem that there are two worlds. I mean, there are two whole societies in this country where there's just such an incredibly steep drop-off. I mean, the big surprise to me, sort of traveling around this country, is how many places there are that just seem to be in decline, where people's health is in decline, their prospects are in decline, where they don't see a future, but they can't afford to leave because they can't afford to live in one of the places where there are jobs. And this, I think this was allowed to develop to a very advanced point before Brexit was even on the table. So I think it's taken on the energy from this shearing off of one Britain from the other. And I think one way or the other, the left and the right and the center have to somehow speak to those people. I mean, to be honest, I think the people that went for Brexit were also the people that were damaged by austerity. So I think the right and the left end up overlapping a lot. One way or the other, their problems have to be addressed.
But the social Europe is actually as a slogan, something that people is something that comes up. Like in France, that came up a lot as something that I think people would go for. They just didn't see any hope for it to happen. And what's sort of interesting there, I talked about the sort of absence of a language of the future. And if you think, I don't know if you agree. I mean, we're all Europeans, sort of, what I always felt, the first time I left Europe was when I was 17 and I went to the United States. And I remember, this was sort of, I went to a school there for a while, and I remember going to the doctor for the first time and being asked for a credit card. And I remember I was like, what? And a Swedish friend was with me, and we were both like, what? And this idea that you have to pay for healthcare, and so, in other words, when I left this continent for the first time, I realized that there's something that unites us in Europe beyond our borders that is very powerful, and that is this idea of a welfare state and of solidarity. And it's sort of fading, unfortunately, but it's sort of been part, I would argue, of European identity. And what's sort of sad in a way to see is that the parties that embodied this and actually helped build these systems over 150 years, they are dying. I mean, the social democracy is dying in Europe right now, and to me, again, that's sort of tragic and sad, because I feel like that embodies a huge part of European identity. But maybe it's also an opportunity. Maybe this is the moment where somebody comes up with a recipe to embody this again. It feels late in the day, but that might be like there you might have a language for the future, because people are looking for protection, right? And the nationalists are saying, we'll protect you from migrants, or we'll protect you from like Brussels. But if somebody came along and said, we'll protect you from inequality, and we'll protect your way of life in a fairer way, and actually find some good solutions, I think that could resonate.
Should we do number 1?
Thank you so much. My name is Erica. Thank you also for the daily. I'm from the States, obviously, and it keeps me grounded and home every day, so thank you for it.
Thank you.
My question really relates to what you just said. I'm a global health master's student, and I went to a talk this year with a GP here in the NHS who had voted for Brexit from the left, who was hearkening back to that kind of early welfare state, the founding of the NHS, principles of social democracy, and wanting to get back there, feeling that that was what had been lost. And I wonder if you could comment on the kind of irony of that, the longing for a kind of cohesive, we're in this together state, while also being part of a nationalist kind of separatist movement in a way, and maybe even in kind of relation to President Trump's recent comment that he walked back, that I'm not convinced he actually walked back, about the NHS being on the table in a potential trade deal with the US, what that means for the irony of trying to leave something that was perceived as undemocratic in the EU and landing in the lap of transnational corporations, which are the least democratic things in the world. So, thank you.
Big question. We're going to do one more question after this, because I know we're getting to the end of our thing, but go ahead.
Well, it is sort of notable that the NHS brought a screeching halt to what appeared to be almost universal welcome for Trump. And I do think when people are brought face to face with what it would mean to have a release of drug prices, basically we pay 10 times, 20 times as much for the same drugs in America as Britons do for their drugs, because they bargain for mass purchases. So I think when people realize what it's going to mean, I think that actually can move the dial a little bit. And then as far as social welfare, it's notable that in the Nordic countries, a lot of the anti-immigrant parties are left-wing, and what they are all about is protecting the welfare state by shutting the doors and making sure that people who are going to demand too much for the welfare state aren't allowed in the country. So I think that's a place where it goes from the right to the left pretty easily.
So we're going to do one more, because we've reached our magic hour of 8:30. So,
upstairs?
All right, the eagerness of falling.
Yeah. Don't fall.
Make it count.
Yeah.
No problem.
I actually have 2 questions. One that's really bothering me. So I'm German and I'm living in London, so I have kind of a connection. I'm a deeply convinced European, and one argument I'm always missing is how much the individual profits from the European Union. We have the individual profits from the European Union. The only reason we have such a high level of consumer protection is actually because of the European Union. The amount of healthcare we have, the amount of protection against competition law is all due to the European Union. And I think in all these nationalistic movements, there's a problem with marketing in the European Union. They don't explain to the individual enough how much they do. That's my perspective. And so that's kind of the question, how you perceive that during your journey. And the second one is, everyone is building up blocks now. So we have the United States that's kind of blocking from the entire world, unfortunately. We have China, we have Russia. Where do we see ourselves in 30 years if we, as the European Union, are not sticking together? Because I feel like in 30 years, Russia will not ring Luxembourg and ask for their opinion. Possibly they will also not ring Germany anymore. But I'm just wondering, where's the future perspective if we don't stick together now? What are we going to be as 28 European states in 30 years?
I like your question, because it's like we haven't talked about the EU as an entity. Is it just a terrible conveyor of its own message?
I mean, Roger Cohen, one of our great columnists, once described Europe as the world's most poorly marketed miracle. And I thought he kind of nailed it. I think you're right. I think you're probably still, if I may speak from a position of privilege, and this is again something, as am I, and I felt humbled on my trip because I realized my assumption, because I was talking to these I was like, but you can just travel, you don't need to show your passport, and you don't need to change your money, and you can go and study, and you can do Erasmus, and they're not doing any of these things because they're actually so limited beyond a certain income, and it's not just the destitute, it's actually a sort of a lower working class, and they have advantages, no doubt, on some level, but in terms of the concrete benefits that we see very regularly, they don't see them.
Can I just, sorry,
sure, follow up.
But my major kind of advantage is, and no one, I've discussed that with many people, and no one has ever said that's wrong, is online shopping. We conclude valid contracts, everyone does. Like, no matter what you vote or whether you actually vote, you conclude a valid contract on the internet, and you can just rescind from that contract because of EU competition law. That is so amazing to me. And that's like, and you can send and everyone, like every 18-year-old in France, Italy can do that.
But if you have €2 to cook a meal for a family of 5, that doesn't matter.
But I think that a lot of people are confusing what kind of the European Union as a political concept with what the economy we opted for also does, and the financial crisis in 2008.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think we can all agree that there have been a whole range of advantages that have been brought about by the European Union. The problem is that on some of the big questions, it has disproportionately benefited those with privilege and disproportionately those without privilege. And that needs addressing. And it's not just the EU, but it's democracy, it's all these big things. Just quickly on the block thing, I mean, you are absolutely right. And I think this is something foremost on a lot of politicians' minds. I mean, Angela Merkel, this is her big thing. Like, you know, the world order is breaking apart. We can't rely on America anymore. And it's not just about Trump. It's sort of structurally things are shifting. America's focused on China. Transatlantic relations aren't going to go back to what they were. You know, Europe needs to stand on its own feet, and it needs to work together if it wants to matter in the world. Russia, just as much as Trump, wants to destroy the European Union. And all these far-right movements are sort of little fifth columns for Russia, with the exception of some of the Eastern European ones that don't like Russia very much for obvious reasons. But, you know, the Italians, the French, even Orban, I mean, you know, they very closely cooperate with Russia. So, you know, and I heard an interesting and sort of scary story recently about China, you know, having invested very, very heavily in Greece, on the back of this sort of, you know, desperate austerity that caused so much social and human pain in Greece after the financial crisis or the economic crisis there, now sort of almost dictating how Greece votes on certain European issues. So I don't want to overstate it, but there's a sort of sense that China might have a proxy vote in the EU via Greece. I mean, meanwhile, Russia is coming in and being very close to some of these far-right parties. So your point is absolutely right. And it feels, again, very late in the day to be seriously talking about this issue. I don't think it's too late, by the way. One guy, and this question was asked earlier, I feel like I answered it poorly about who you should follow, like the good ideas and so on. I'm going to come and talk to you at the reception. But there's one other guy I recommend, and I'll think of some woman too. Timothy Snyder is great, and you know, I'm sure there's stuff online. He recently spoke in Oxford, and he's spoken up a lot about Europe, and he is much more upbeat about the sort of the opportunity for Europe to find that language of the future and have a plan, whether it's on a sort of social democratic idea of, redistributing not just wealth, but also respect, right? And sort of attention. And also about just sort of standing your ground, having your vision for the future in a world where America is kind of looking back. It's sort of a weird nostalgia, nationalism, something. And then there is China, which is, you know, full power ahead with very much a vision for the future. Yeah, so basically, let me sum this up, Michael.
Thank you.
I think there's a big political space up for grabs. You know, the simple fact that Europeans don't want to leave the EU, but they really don't like it, shows there is This is up for grabs, the space. And the jury's still out. But I think the next few years will be pretty decisive.
And I think the next 5 days of the Daily are going to tell a remarkable story. I think you're getting a little bit of a sense of the kind of talent that we're working with here. I really want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank you for supporting and listening to the Daily, and supporting and hopefully subscribing to the New York Times, and for giving us your time, your empathy, and your intelligence. We are so, so grateful. So thank you all very much. Thank you. And it wouldn't be proper if I didn't sign off. I'm Michael Barbaro. I will see you on Monday.